The engines of the Boeing roared against the vast silence of the Pacific night. Outside, storm clouds stretched like bruises across the sky, swallowing the stars. When the first violent jolt ripped through the cabin, trays rattled, overhead bins shook, and passengers gasped as if the air itself had turned hostile. Fear spread in whispers, then in rising panic, until the captain's voice cracked through the intercom, heavy with urgency. The navigation systems had failed. The storm was tightening around them. He asked a question that landed like a stone in the pit of every heart on board. Was there any combat pilot among the passengers? Eyes darted across the rows of faces. Mothers clutching children, businessmen fumbling with phones, elderly couples gripping hands, all scanning the cabin for a savior. But all they saw was a man asleep by the window in seat 8A. His head leaned slightly against the pane, his chest rising and falling with the steady calm of someone untouched by the chaos. Draped across his shoulders was not an airline blanket, but a faded military poncho liner, frayed at the edges, the kind carried through years of deployment. His name was Adrian Cole. At first, no one moved. Then a businessman in a tailored suit sneered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "That guy don't bother. He's the one who made headlines after coming it. A gay pilot, if you can even call him that. He was pushed out of the Air Force for a reason." The words struck the silence like a match, igniting quiet laughter, smirks, and doubt of the heart. Even in this moment, when lives trembled in the balance, prejudice still found its way into the air. Adrian slept on, unaware that his very existence had already been dismissed as a liability. Turbulence slammed again, sending a drink cart skidding across the aisle. The flight attendants clutched the seats for balance, their face pale with the truth they could not say out loud without someone who could fly through combat skies. The situation would spiral toward disaster. The captain repeated his plea, more desperate now, his voice cracking as he admitted the autopilot was useless against the storm. Passengers turned once more to the figure in 8A. How could it be him? Of all people, this man they remembered from old articles, the one branded unfit, the one laughed at for daring to live openly. In their fear, they repeated the words of the businessman in their heads. How could someone like him possibly carry the weight of 243 souls? Yet fate often writes its stories with cruel irony. Beneath that worn poncho was the same man who had once flown fighter jets through skies far more dangerous than this, who had lived with the constant hum of artillery and the taste of sand in his teeth, who had learned to rest in chaos because war never allowed time to sleep. And now, as the plane shook and the storm outside clawed at the fuselage, the world was about to discover that the only chance of survival lay in the hands of the man they doubted most, because no one could see it yet. But Adrian Cole dismissed, humiliated, forgotten was the single hope for every soul aboard. The story of this flight would not be about machines or turbulence. It would be about a man who carried scars deeper than storms, a man who had been told he was nothing, and who was about to prove that he was everything. In that moment of unspoken judgment, the lesson was already unfolding. Fear makes people search for strength in familiar shapes and familiar faces, but true courage rarely wears the mask society expects. Sometimes the hero is the very one they cast aside. If you believe that dignity and bravery know no boundaries, not of gender, not of love, and not of labels forced upon us, stay with this story until the end. And if you want more journeys that strike the heart and refuse to let go, follow Heart Stories, where the stories you never forget find their voice. The violent sway of the aircraft finally shook Adrian awake. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim cabin lights that flickered each time lightning cracked beyond the windows. Confused murmurs surrounded him. Faces were pale, lips pressed tight, hands clasped in prayer. Then the announcement reached his ears, and in an instant, the haze of sleep vanished. The captain had called for a combat pilot. Adrian rose, folded his old poncho liner across the seat, and stepped into the aisle. As he walked forward, whispers spread behind him like a rumor carried by the wind. Some passengers stared in relief, others in doubt, and a few with outright contempt. The businessman who had mocked him earlier muttered again, loud enough to sting, "God help us if that's all we've got." But Adrian ignored the sting, moving toward the cockpit with a steady stride. At the locked door, he produced his military ID, edges worn but still bearing the insignia of service. The flight attendants glanced between one another, hesitant, before relaying his presence to the cockpit. A tense click signaled the door opening, and Adrian stepped inside to face the crew. Captain Morrison, jaw clenched, studied the card then the man before him. His hesitation was plain. His eyes flicked sideways toward his co-pilot, as though seeking silent confirmation of his own doubts. His voice dropped to a murmur, yet it carried the weight of dismissal. "I know this name." Cole was discharged. Not for lack of skill, but for reasons incompatible with military conduct. The words hung heavy, sharp as broken glass. Chen, the first officer, sneered openly, his tone cutting. "So this is who you bring us? We're supposed to hand over hundreds of lives to someone thrown out because he didn't meet the Air Force's standards." His pause left no one unsure of what he meant. The unspoken word was his sexuality, as though being gay made Adrian unfit to hold the controls. Adrian stood silent under the scrutiny. He could have shouted back, could have demanded respect, but anger would only waste time. Instead, he pointed toward the blinking radar screens. "You have 90 minutes of fuel left," he said evenly, his voice calm against the storm's roar. "Stay on this course and you'll enter the storm's heart. The engines will choke in the turbulence. You need to adjust your vector now." The room froze. His words were not bluster, but precision, cut from years of lived experience. Still, doubt lingered. Morrison's lips pressed together, his fingers drumming the console as though weighing whether to trust a man the system itself had rejected. The co-pilot scoffed, muttering that they had trained for emergencies like this. But even through his pride, uncertainty clouded his eyes. The silence in the cockpit was not simple quiet. It was suspicion pressing against the truth. These were men trained to believe that difference equaled weakness. And here stood Adrian Cole, his very existence used as evidence against him, while outside the storm battered harder and the clock on the fuel gauge ticked away the minutes of safety they thought they still possessed. Adrian did not plead. He knew that arguments about who he was would never pierce the armor of prejudice. Instead, he let the facts, the instruments, and the inevitability of the storm speak louder than his past. The question was no longer about his identity, but about survival. And in that moment, a painful truth rose. Society often clings to its narrow definitions even when danger demands unity. They wanted a savior shaped by their expectations, not the one they had. Yet storms do not pause for human bias. Disaster does not discriminate. And courage, when it appears, comes not from fitting into their idea of acceptable, but from the refusal to let fear dictate the outcome. The storm grew heavier as the minutes passed. Each new shudder of the fuselage sent gasps through the cabin, trays clattering, overhead compartments threatening to burst open. The air was thick with the sound of fear-children wailing, prayers whispered into trembling hands, and the occasional scream as lightning flashed so close it illuminated every face with a ghostly light. A flight attendant stumbled into the cockpit, eyes wet, voice breaking as she admitted passengers were panicking, some unable to breathe through their terror. Adrian slid into the auxiliary seat beside the captain. He did not ask permission again. His movements carried the discipline of someone who had been in chaos before, who knew that hesitation was a greater enemy than the storm itself. His voice cut through the noise, sharp and steady. "Reduce speed, adjust altitude by 2,000 feet, shift heading 7 degrees east." He spoke without drama, without hesitation. Each order measured against the violence outside. Morrison's hands trembled on the yoke, but he followed the instructions. Chen muttered his objections, yet mirrored the commands. Slowly, the plane steadied from its wild jerks into a controlled, if fragile, rhythm. For the first time in what felt like eternity, The turbulence ceased to feel like a death sentence and more like a fight with a chance. As Adrian's eyes scanned the controls, the glow of the instruments reflected memories he had tried to bury. He remembered the mockery in the barracks, the word ghost gaze scratched onto his locker door, the whispers when he walked past, the way comrades pulled away as though his presence was contamination. He remembered the moment he confessed love to a fellow soldier and the punishment that followed not by court-martial, but by shame, ridicule, and forced resignation cloaked under the phrase "no longer fit for duty." Those scars had never left him. He carried them not on his skin, but deep in his chest. Reminders of a country that had celebrated his bravery one day and condemned his truth the next. For years, he lived in silence. The memory of cockpits replaced by empty nights where his worth was questioned even in his own mind. Now, as the lightning raged and wind clawed at the wings, those same hands once made to feel unworthy tightened on the instruments with unshakable command. The strength that society tried to erase was the strength saving them now. The rhythm of the storm became familiar, echoing battles he had flown through long ago. Each shift of air a puzzle his instincts could still solve. Behind the cockpit door, passengers clutched one another as the aircraft steadied under Adrian's guidance. Some no longer cared who he was, only that he held the knowledge to steer them away from death. Yet others still whispered doubt, clinging to their prejudice even as their lives rested on his skill. Adrian ignored it all. He focused on the monitors, on the subtle tilt of the wings, on the storm's patterns no algorithm could predict, but that his years in combat had etched into muscle memory. His breath remained even, his orders precise. And in that fragile balance between fear and control, the first sparks of trust flickered. Then the fuel indicator blinked, a cruel reminder of the clock ticking down. Morrison read the numbers aloud, his voice cracking. Barely over 80 minutes remained before the tanks ran dry. The calm Adrian had built in the cabin teetered once more, the knowledge spreading like fresh panic. A controlled descent was no longer enough, they would need a destination. The moment revealed a truth no storm could hide. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Adrian had been broken by a system that judged his identity more harshly than his ability. Yet here he was, not asking for recognition, only doing what needed to be done. It was a reminder to everyone who watched him work that strength cannot be measured by conformity, but by resilience when the world demands surrender. The cockpit was lit in the trembling glow of warning signals. Each red blink, another reminder that the clock of survival was running short. Outside, the storm still lashed the fuselage, waves of turbulence rocking the aircraft like a fragile toy. Adrian leaned forward, his eyes never leaving the navigation screen as he reached for the radio. Static hissed, drowning most of his first attempts, but persistence carved through the noise until at last, a voice from the U.S. Coast Guard answered. Through fragments of interference, coordinates were exchanged, calculations confirmed. Adrian's brows furrowed as he traced their position against a map in his head, one learned through countless missions flown long before this night. They were off course by nearly 300 miles, drifting into empty air with no safe landing in range. The nearest option was a military airfield, Fairchild Air Force Base, the same place that had once closed its gates on him with finality, stamping his record with the word unfit. The name alone made Captain Morrison stiffen. His reluctance was immediate. That base isn't equipped for civilian landings at this hour, he muttered, voice tight with resistance. The hesitation hung heavy, a barrier made of pride and protocol. But Adrian's reply was steady, carrying none of the bitterness the memory deserved. The runways are long enough. The approach path is safer than any alternative. We don't have the luxury of choosing comfort. Fairchild is the only chance. Chen scoffed, shaking his head. So not only are we trusting a disgraced pilot, now we're supposed to follow him back to the very place that threw him out. This is madness. His words, sharp as ever, seemed to fill the cabin with poison. But behind the barbs was fear, and beneath that fear, the reluctant recognition that Adrian was right. The storm gave them no time for argument. Sheets of rain struck the windows in unrelenting force, and hail clattered against the fuselage like stones hurled by an unseen hand. Adrian seized the moment, his tone firm and unwavering. He directed adjustments to altitude, mapped a corridor between violent air currents, and guided Morrison through the narrow gap pilots call a corridor of calm. It was no broader than the margin of error that separated survival from disaster. Yet Adrian traced it with the certainty of someone who had lived too long inside storms. Minute by minute, the aircraft followed his commands, threading through invisible corridors while lightning split the sky on either side. The passengers could not see the precision of his choices, but they felt the difference in their bodies as the fueling shutters softened into a controlled glide. Whispers of relief began to ripple through the cabin, though no one dared to believe safety was assured. The runway lights of Fairchild finally pierced the darkness below, glowing faint against the storm but unmistakable to Adrian's eyes. His throat tightened at the sight, not only from relief but from the memories it carried. This was the place where he had been told his identity erased his worth, where signatures on papers had ended the career he thought would define his life. And now, fate demanded that he return not as the man they discarded, but as the one holding hundreds of lives above despair. Morrison's voice shook as he read out the approach. Adrian countered each doubt with a command grounded in certainty. Through the storm's fury, the plane descended, guided not by machinery but by instinct, sharpened in years of combat flights. When the wheels struck the runway at last, bouncing once before gripping hard into the asphalt, a wave of cries and applause erupted behind the cockpit. Passengers clung to one another, some weeping openly, others whispering prayers of gratitude. Relief spread like a tide, crashing louder than the storm itself. For Adrian, there was no celebration. His chest rose with controlled breaths as he watched the runway lights blur through sheets of rain. He had brought them down safely, but the landing was more than survival. It was a collision between his past and his present, proof that worth cannot be erased by prejudice, even when authority insists otherwise. The storm outside was real, violent, merciless, but storms of judgment, too, have a way of surrounding people until they forget their own strength. And just as Adrian had guided a plane through wind and lightning, he had also shown that sometimes the only way forward is to walk back into the places that once broke you, and prove that you never truly lost your wings. The aircraft rolled to a final stop on the soaked tarmac, brakes hissing against the rain. Passengers erupted in applause, some crying into each other's shoulders, others whispering gratitude to a man most of them had doubted only an hour before. For Adrian, the sound barely pierced the pounding of his own heart. He unbuckled, rose slowly, and stepped down the narrow aisle as people leaned into the aisle to glimpse the pilot who was not supposed to be theirs. At the bottom of the stairs, the storm still raged. Rain pelted his face, soaking the poncho liner folded beneath his arm, but standing in the glow of floodlights was a figure Adrian recognized instantly. The years had silvered his hair and not softened his presence. General Marcus Washington, the man who had signed the discharge papers that ended Adrian's military career, stood waiting at the foot of the runway. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt as sharply as the plane had in the storm. Washington's voice cracked the silence, low but unsteady. "Cole, you just saved 243 lives." His gaze dropped, then lifted again, the weight of regret unhidden. "We were wrong. We told ourselves your identity was a weakness, when in truth, it was never our place to measure your worth by who you are." The words struck harder than any turbulence. Adrian's jaw tightened. He did not answer immediately, for the apology was not just for him, but for every soldier ever erased by prejudice, every voice silenced by rules dressed as morality. He looked at the man who had ended his dream and realized he no longer needed his permission to exist. Before he could speak, officials arrived, rushing through the rain with messages from the Department of Defense. The story of the flight had already spread through emergency channels. Adrian's leadership had been undeniable, and the decision was swift. A new program would be created, one designed to train pilots for emergencies on civilian flights, blending combat discipline with commercial responsibility. And they wanted Adrian to lead it. The man once dismissed as a liability was now being asked to shape the future of aviation safety. Passengers stepped off the plane in waves, some pausing to thank him, some too overcome with shame to meet his eyes after doubting him so openly. Even the businessman who had mocked him earlier approached slowly, words of apology stumbling from his lips. Adrian nodded once, not out of bitterness, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had proven himself not through anger, but through action. Standing on that tarmac, rain pouring around him, Adrian felt no triumph in the traditional sense. What he felt was heavier and purer release. For years, he had carried the weight of rejection, of being told his love and his truth negated his skill, his sacrifice, his courage. Tonight, in front of those who doubted, he had not only reclaimed his place, but rewritten the very narrative that once destroyed him. The storm would pass, the headlines would fade, but one truth would remain: society had tried to erase him, yet his difference had been the very thing that saved them all. For every young man or woman watching from the sidelines, told that they are less than because of who they are, Adrian's story now stood as proof that what the world discards often carries the strength to save it. The lesson was not about storms or planes. It was about how prejudice blinds people to the very qualities that can rescue them. When fear strikes, the measure of a person is not in their conformity, but in their resilience. And resilience often belongs to those who have already survived being pushed aside. So let me ask you, if you had been on that plane, would you have trusted Adrian from the moment he stood up? Or would you have doubted him like the others? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to follow Heart Stories, where every voice, no matter how silenced, finds its place again.